Okay, this is the lecture for the end of the learning chapter, which we covered 2/3 of back when we were meeting in class before we are on this 2-week COVID-19 break. Because there's been some time in between the point where we were working together in class compared to now, what I'm going to do is dovetail back up to about slide 20 or so, just by quickly reviewing the first 19 or so slides, just to get a feel for how the chapter plays itself out, and then we'll finish up with the remaining slides in their full description. So this was the learning chapter, and the learning chapter starts off with a definition for learning that you see here. Learning is the process by which a relatively permanent change of behavior occurs. Relatively permanent is the key words in the definition here, and that is because learning, as it is frequently contrasted with memory, really refers to how things change. That is, the process of learning is about acquiring new patterns of behavior or eliminating old patterns of behavior. The retention of the pattern of behavior itself is an issue of memory, and that's an entirely separate set of variables. A fair amount of overlap between learning and memory, but a different set of variables that have to be dealt with in a separate chapter. So when you think about learning, always think about how behavior changes, how a new pattern of behavior is acquired, or how an old pattern of behavior is eliminated. But the simple retention of a memory that you might not be consciously aware of, that you're not thinking about the current time, like where did you park your car, which was probably not something you've been thinking about just a moment ago, actually resides in your brain somewhere, and that is an issue of memory. So we did an iClicker question about, which of these following shows that a learning process had occurred. Really, the answer is all of them. If any of those things, A through D, occur, clearly some learning had to have occurred. Now, the story of learning really kind of takes place in two locations in the world, St. Petersburg, Russia, and up at Harvard University. Um, the work done at Harvard kind of squeezes out Pavlov by about 6 years, but generally we talk about Pavlov first, not because he came first, but because it's a little bit easier to kind of lay out the framework, the landscape of learning from the standpoint of the way Pavlov did it, and then to carry on with the work that was started at Harvard University with a fellow named Edward Thorndike. Now, Pavlov was in 1901 actually working with a fellow named Ivan Tolochinov, who was a psychiatrist in St. Petersburg, who used to volunteer his time in Pavlov's laboratory when he had the opportunity to, so that way he could stay abreast of the most recent advances in neuroscience, although they didn't use the term neuroscience back then. And that's why Tolochinov was working in Pavlov's lab. It came around 1901 or so that Pavlov uh, designed the experiments that had to be done that eventually led to the type of conditioning that we now call classical conditioning or Pavlovian conditioning. And it was actually Tolochinov who sat in the room with the dogs conducting the experiments. This is actually got it historically down to February of 1901 is when all of this work actually took place. Now, Pavlov, back in his time, thought of associations as being the smallest usable unit that would have anything to do with behavior change. And that smallest usable unit he referred to as mental atoms. And the idea of mental atoms actually came from Mendeleev in the periodic table, answer D. And if you were in class, you might remember it's one of those times where the answer is actually on the next slide. The story of the periodic table actually goes like this. Mendeleev, who was a chemist in the 1880s, was working diligently at his desk at his home, trying to understand how to organize the known elements of the time, and fell asleep and dreamt the periodic table. When he woke up, he wrote it down, and we've had it ever since. And this aspect of Mendeleev dreaming the solution to the periodic table is actually an extension of the work from the previous chapter before learning, because we were on the chapter of states of consciousness where we spent most of our time discussing sleeping and dreaming, and eventually ended the chapter with the story that dreaming is primarily related to memory consolidation and, secondly, creative problem solving, both of which seem to be very closely tied to the REM stage of sleep. So with that tie-in, and all these two chapters actually being part of exam 2, I think it's a cross-chapter aspect that you should keep in mind. Now, Pavlov, having been at St. Petersburg University as a student, actually went through Mendeleev's chemistry class and learned about the periodic table only a year or two after it was actually created. Pavlov graduates from the University of St. Petersburg, gets a job there as a professor, is now a colleague of Mendeleev, and Pavlov's brother, Dmitri, actually becomes the lab tech in Mendeleev's chemistry lab. So it's very clear that Pavlov is fully aware of the idea of atoms from the story of, or from the field of chemistry, and he borrows that idea and applies it to the concept of associations. That if two things, and this was Pavlov's approach to it, if two things in the environment are associated together in space or time, then they will become automatically associated based upon the operation of your nervous system. Consequently, these associations will build up in certain ways and form intelligence. And intelligence, you have to put that in quotes. It's just a general way to phrase how knowledge is developed from the standpoint of associations. This concept of mental atoms has actually worked fairly well for the field of conditioning. So in the field of conditioning, can any learning take place without associations? No, not at all. It's not possible. In fact, there is even such a thing as what's called non-associative learning. And non-associative learning involves associations. It simply was named non-associative because a single stimulus presented to a subject is not being explicitly associated with other stimuli in the environment. And so it got the name non-associative learning. But it's not possible to actually present a single stimulus to a subject, any living organism, and not have the presence of that stimulus become associated with any other stimulus that happens to be present in the environment at that time. You have to remember that all 6 of your sensory systems are operating at any one time, and as a result, your nervous system, through its natural process of associations, will associate all 6 of the stimuli occurring at any one moment in time with each other in all possible combinations. And as you'll wind up seeing as we go through this chapter, it's really the selective focus on associations that are relevant for patterns of behavior at that current time that kind of rise up into consciousness, and the others don't make it there, and oftentimes are simply eliminated as a memory to no longer exist in the nervous system at all. We did watch a 13-minute video on the video shot in Pavlov's lab. involving the original dog salivation experiments, a gross motor behavior in a monkey, and the cookie shooting device with a small boy. We're not going to watch that now. Um, it's just really no point to kind of redo it. And once we finished that movie, one of the things that kind of came out of it that we really had to talk about in class was just how important Pavlov's work actually was. And it was very important because prior to his development of associating stimuli with other stimuli that become associated together and modify behavior in particular ways, there was essentially no way to figure out which cells under the skin of a subject were actually had which particular properties, what range of capacity, what did they actually allow the subject to detect, and so forth. And so once Pavlov's initial experiments were completed, it was clear that you could actually evaluate the differences between rods and cones in the eye, the various receptors in your skin, your nose, your tongue, and so forth. And that led to an enormous increase in research in the field of biology that was done primarily from the standpoint of psychophysics, which is now a tie-in to material from 2 chapters ago. In Chapter 5, when we covered sensation and perception, we covered the basics of psychophysics. And when Pavlov had completed his work in 1901 or thereabouts, and started to show that he could establish which receptors were connected to which patterns of behavior, the field of biology started to do that kind of work in the context of psychophysics to get that mathematical precision that had been around since the 1850s when Fechner had created the concept of the just noticeable difference. And then the field of biology just exploded with information on sensory research. Of course, sensory research is important for the field of psychology as well. And so the field of psychology really kind of started to blow up at that time, especially from the standpoint of conditioning. Conditioning, psychophysics, sensory evaluations, and the processes of learning. Those were all areas that really grew very rapidly at the very beginning of the 20th century. So when we ask a question, and this question, you might remember, is a tie-in all the way back to the developmental chapter. Which experimental methodology would eventually be developed due to Pavlov's research? The answer was the habituation assessments of human babies. Back in the developmental chapter, I talked about how, in probably the greatest brain fart of all of psychology, a process for evaluating the cognitive structure of animals was developed, which was this habituation processes that are used in developmental psychology are kind of an outgrowth of the work of Pavlov. And for nearly 60 years, that work was only applied to non-humans. And eventually, by around the late 60s, people started to apply to human babies because from a functional standpoint, human babies don't have language, which makes them the same as non-humans who also don't have language. So you can figure out the cognitive structure of a rat or a pigeon, but you can also apply the same methodological process in habituation assessments with human babies. And that led again to another explosion of research in the field of development that crossed over quite a bit with Pavlovian work, and specifically the habituation variation of this whole process. Now, to fully appreciate Pavlov's work, there are 4 terms that have to be evaluated, which I am flipping back and forth to on the screen here. There are 2 stimuli, a conditional stimulus and a non-conditional stimulus. By now, it's probably clear to you that in Pavlov's work, and in particular the movie that we watched from Pavlov's laboratory, the metronome served the role of the conditional stimulus. which is oftentimes referred to as a neutral stimulus because it does not elicit any pattern of behavior by itself. And then it is paired with an unconditional stimulus, which in this case is oftentimes in the videos we saw was some food item. Now, the CS and the US are both stimuli. Note that the letter S is in the second position of the abbreviation CS and US. S means stimulus, and a stimulus is a thing an experimenter controls. So it is not a source of data to be evaluated in an experiment. And I point that out because you're going to have to, as I flip the screen here to the new slide, distinguish between what the experimenter controls and what the experimenter measures in a Pavlovian conditioning experiment. Here, you have a conditional response and an unconditional response, CR or UR. Both abbreviations end with the letter R. R always refers to response, and responses are things the subjects are doing, so they are sources of data. Now, flipping back again to the previous slide, a CS is the only stimulus that generates a CR. And when I flip back again, a US is the only stimulus that generates a UR. So conditional stimuli don't control any responding in the beginning, but when the CS is paired with the US repeatedly, the CR will start to be elicited from the CS itself. The UR always occurs as a response to the presence of the US. And that's reflected in the name, unconditional. When you say something's unconditional, you're basically just saying it just occurs. And one of the common ways you use the word unconditional is to refer to unconditional love. Love that comes regardless of whether you do something good or bad, somebody still loves you. It's unconditional love. It's just always there. And the word is being used essentially the same way in this case. An unconditional response is a response that occurs to the US always. It does not require any special condition to make it occur. And there are three examples here, like startle reflexes, salivation, certainly the one that Pavlov used, and in a variety of other research. If you carry on in your field of psychology, you'll see a lot of electric shock research from the early 20th century that essentially served the same purpose as the UR from Pavlov's salivation experiments. A couple of questions here. The conditional stimulus in this case, the best answer, even though you might make arguments for any one of them, vending machines is the best answer in this case, and that's because for a vending machine can drop out some candy or food item that you would ingest. But the vending machine always occurs first. You don't approach a food item and then a vending machine appears. That doesn't exist. You approach the vending machine first and then the food item comes out of it. And that temporal sequence is always present, and therefore it makes that first cue, that giant metal box that would have no capacity to make you salivate in and of itself unless it was associated with food, the conditional stimulus. In the next question, this one, identify the conditional response. This was a gimme question, or at least so I thought. Salivation to the bell after bell food pairings. I mean, that is exactly the same example we had been using again and again. It's in the textbook. It's connected with Pavlov. It's what we had been talking about. That one, at least I perceived, should have been easy. Now, as we move on, one of the things about classical conditioning that you start to see, it's going to carry over to the whole story of operant conditioning and even into the later chapter next on the memory chapter, is that what you see on the screen now is essentially a short list of all the basic variables that control associative learning. So any learning that occurs through associations is controlled by the set of variables that you see on the screen here. The aspects of psychophysics, which we talked about 2 chapters ago. In that same chapter, we talked about the Gestalt, which remember is the role of the context. the attentional process, you have one attentional capacity and that's it. So when you multitask, you always divide your attention across multiple tasks. Sensory and perceptual illusions, which were part of Chapter 5 as well. Role of neuroplasticity, which if neuroplasticity didn't occur, right, that is, if the cells in your brain literally did not wire themselves every 24 hours, you would not be able to learn anything new, because new learning to be held as a memory requires cells in your brain to rewire the connections that exist. So the concept of a memory, as we're going to wind up moving to in chapter 8, in the memory chapter, is that a memory is essentially going to exist in your brain as a network of cells, or kind of as a broad distributed pathway of a lot of electrical activity, but not as a single entity like a large protein molecule that sits in one place. Instead, it's a network of cells that all work together in a particular functional process. And when you start to change any part of that network, then you start to modify the memory that comes out, given whatever types of inputs have actually elicited it. The last two parts there, the space, duration, of frequency, and symbolic meaning, those they're there because this is really the big set of things that controls associative learning. But we're going to wind up focusing on those last two bullet points in the memory chapter, so I'm not going to bother talking about them any longer. We did talk about how in the very beginning, acquisition and the elimination of responding, formerly called extinction, are really the two parts that primarily are associated with the processes of learning. Again, not the retention of information over a long period of time where you're not activating the learned behavior, but rather just acquiring it and eliminating it. Follow the rules of learning. And then nearly where we are finishing here, we were talking about the roles of generalization and discrimination, which were essentially just two ends of the same continuum that represent the degree to which a cue that had been associated with a US controls your behavior relative to other cues that are similar to it that may still control your behavior. So if you look at the 7 primary colors of the spectrum, right in the very center is green, and on either end of green is yellow on one side and blue on the other. So if you paired a green light with food repeatedly for a person who could detect green, and then you show them green, pair it with food, do that over and over and over again, the green light should cause salivation, and then you could take that green light and start making it more toward a yellowish color or more toward a bluish color. And in either case, you would still get control for salivation from yellow or blue, but to a lesser degree than the original central color of green actually would have controlled your behavior. And that drop off, which looks somewhat symmetric on either side of the central cue that was associated with food, is essentially what's going to be called the generalization gradient. In fact, there's a slight image. Actually, if I hop ahead here, there we go. There's a generalization gradient on the bottom of this particular slide here, a sharp one and a broad one. And those are just common examples of how they would typically look. Now, not dragging the earlier parts of this chapter out too much, we did start to talk about John Watson and what is frequently referred to as the Little Albert experiment. However, as I've warned you, the Little Albert experiment was not an experiment. It did not have any proper controls. It would fail as an undergraduate project today as a result of the lacking control aspects of methodology that were present in it. This demonstration, more than anything, was all about, in fact, let's see if we can get it running here. I think we are, yeah. This whole demonstration that was related to little Albert was nothing more than Watson, who you see on the screen right now, attempting to prove that he understood phobias better than Sigmund Freud, because Watson followed a very strong scientific process and, for the technology of his time, relied primarily on aspects of conditioning as a way to describe behavior. Sigmund Freud, who we have not talked about yet, used a very mentalistic concept that, even formally by its own model, told you that there were aspects of mental activity in a person that you directly could never access. But Freud came up with the idea that he could understand the stuff that was inaccessible, which should sound like a contradiction, but Freud frankly talked around the topic, and that's largely where all of this wound up. This being about, I think, 1923, this experiment to establish a phobic response in a baby and then later on to eliminate it gets carried out in front of the film so that Watson can send this film around and show people what he was able to do as a way essentially to put himself in a position above what Sigmund Freud could do. Because even probably back around 1920s, I think it was probably clear, as it eventually was anyway, the treatment of a phobia from the process of Freudian psychotherapy would generally be expected to take about 10 years. 10 years of therapy, meeting with a therapist at approximately 5 times per week. Today, a treatment for phobia from the standpoint of conditioning could probably eliminate any phobia, regardless of its intensity, in under 3 months. And that would probably be only in a case of extremely difficult phobia to get rid of. Moving on from this film, we talked about here in the cyclic question, distinguishing between two different types of stimuli to see what of the following possibilities, A through E, constitute discrimination. And the answer is all of the above. So I'll go ahead and leave that to you to take a look at. And we also, again, connected back to the material from the previous chapter, from States of Consciousness, where this film played out an aspect in which a ticking noise from a clock that was played while students were learning about the rules of a logic game was played during REM sleep. And the idea, and this part being most relevant for the learning chapter, an association was formed between the experimenter's verbal description of rules and the background noise of a ticking clock. If those two things had become associated, then the ticking clock could be played to the subjects during REM sleep, and during that time, it should enhance the learning that occurred during REM sleep. And remember, REM sleep seems to be most closely connected to memory consolidation and creative problem solving. And the results of those experiments for related to sleep actually do show just that. By playing the sound of the clock that was associated with the rules of the logic game, there was an enhanced effect of the amount that the subjects could remember the following day. That moved us on to the operant conditioning section, and about the point where we actually have to move on with new material at this point.